Atamarie, I tēnei rā, ka tuku mihi atu ki a Kingi Tuheitia, me te whānau whānui o te kāhui ariki. Rire, rire, hau, paimārire ki a rātou. Kia koutou kua hono mai ki tēnei Karakia o te ata, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I want to welcome you to our morning prayer today. Today would have been Coronation Day for Kingi Tuheitia and for the Kingitanga, but unfortunately it's had to be postponed because of the pandemic and the restrictions. But it's still a day that we recognise and remember, and which I know for many of you is a day of online celebration, even if you can't be together down at Ngaruawahia. So it's great for us this morning to turn to the Lord in prayer. Let's do that now. Kia inoi tātou. E te atua kārawa, e tūwhera ana ngā ngākau katoa ki a koe, e mōhiotia ana ngā hiahia katoa, e kore hoki I ngaro I a koe, te mea huna. Whakahangia iho tō wairua tapu, hei whakamā I ngā whakaro o mātou ngākau, kia tino aroha ai mātou ki a koe, kia tika ai te whakanui I tō ingoa tapu, ko ihu karaiti hoki tō mātou ariki. Amen. A reading from the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 1, and beginning at verse 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from his victory over the Amalekites and spent 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's army camp. He had torn his clothes and put dirt on his head to show that he was in mourning. He fell to the ground before David in deep respect. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I escaped from the Israelite camp," the man replied. "What happened?" David demanded. "Tell me how the battle went." The man replied, "Our entire army fled from the battle. Many of the men are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." "How do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David demanded of the young man. The man answered, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the enemy chariots and charioteers closing in on him. When he turned and saw me, he cried out for me to come to him. 'How can I help?' I asked him. He responded, 'Who are you?' 'I'm an Amalekite,' I told him. Then he begged me, 'Come over here and put me out of my misery, for I am in terrible pain and want to die.' So I killed him," the Amalekite told David, "for I knew he couldn't live. Then I took his crown and his armband, and I have brought them here to you, my lord." David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. Then David said to the young man who had brought the news, "Where are you from?" And he replied, "I'm a foreigner, an Amalekite, who lives in your land." "Why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one?" David asked. Then David said to one of his men, "Kill him." So the man thrust his sword into the Amalekite and killed him. "You have condemned yourself," David said, "for you yourself confessed that you killed the Lord's anointed one." Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jashar. "Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. They shed the blood of their enemies and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing and garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you, and your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, this is quite a striking passage in many ways, because we might have expected David to rejoice because Saul, who's been chasing him all around the country and making David hide, is actually now finally dead. And David is in many ways set free from being harassed and persecuted, but also free to take up the leadership of Israel that he must have looked forward to having and had been promised, in fact, by God. So you might have expected him to rejoice, but he doesn't. And so there's a puzzle here for us to solve. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is the day that would have been Karakia, and we actually have a connection very close to us here in Mangere Bridge. Just up in the Urupa, the graveyard at St James, the oldest Maori Anglican church in Auckland, the oldest Maori church in Auckland actually, in the graveyard there, in the Urupa, are buried two people of great significance, Kati and Matira Toha. Matira was the daughter of Rewa, a Ngāpuhi rangatira, and was married to Kati, partly to cement peace between Ngāpuhi and Tainui. Kati was actually Kingi Tāwhiao's brother, and so was a significant person in his own right, but also significant because of what that marriage meant. And it's a connection for us here, a very direct connection with the kingitanga. Now, normally a coronation day, or the day in this case to remember coronation, to memorialise it, is a day of rejoicing. And in some ways this is almost like David's coronation day. It's certainly the day when he finds out that finally he's going to be able to take up the kingship of Israel. And so just as Karakia is normally a day of great rejoicing, so we would have expected David to rejoice at seeing it become possible for him to become king. And yet this is a day of grief for him. A grief not because of the interruption of some outside event, like in our case coronavirus. It's grief because he can see that somebody who he respected and loved, but also somebody who had been appointed by God, had come to an end. And it's not only Saul that he grieves for, but Saul's son Jonathan, who was this dear friend to David. We'll come back to his grief for Jonathan in a minute. But I want you to notice that not only does this day bring grief to David and to his men, it also brings God's judgment to somebody who expected David to rejoice. We've got this young Amalekite person who comes up to David and tells him what he thinks is good news, that his enemy is dead. And we already know the story of how Saul has died from the previous chapter. We know that Saul, in the end, put his own sword through himself and died that way, and his armor bearer died beside him. This Amalekite makes up a story that's designed to make him look good because of his expectation that David's going to rejoice. He's quite open in saying that he's got Saul's crown and his armband, and he has to come up with some explanation of why he's got these things. He wants to present them to David and be rewarded for being the one who brings this great news to him. So he makes up this story about being the one to have killed Saul, expecting that David would be happy about it. But instead, because David understands that Saul has been anointed, has been crowned king by God himself, he says to the Amalekite, actually, your words have condemned you. Now we know, because we already know the story, that the Amalekite's words were actually false. And so this Amalekite man condemns himself for a story that he's made up. What it tells us is the seriousness with which David took this. This wasn't some fake grief done for PR purposes. He was genuinely grieved to see something of God's plan having come to ruin because of Saul's failure, even though Saul's failure had also in part been something that brought suffering to David. Now I wonder if it's possible for us to appreciate that, to be so committed to God's mission that we are grieved when God's mission is harmed by the failures of people we know, even if those people have caused us suffering. So not only to be angry, which is often justified and right, but to be grieved on God's behalf for the damage that is done to God's kingdom. I wonder too if there's something that has gone a little bit missing from some of our Christian life, and it's the sense that an awareness that to oppose somebody that God has put in place, whether we agree with it or not, to oppose somebody that God has put in place is a very dangerous and risky thing. David asks this really striking question to the Amalekite. He says to him, why weren't you afraid? He's checked already that this is somebody who's lived in the land of Israel, knows the place really well. And he says, why were you not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed, to destroy Yahweh's anointed, naming God personally here? What he's saying is that we ought to be so respectful of God that we should be afraid to do something which risks bringing offence to God. And so the commentator, I've got this wonderful commentary by Dale Ralph Davis, and he says David's question expresses a principle that should direct all kingdom ethics and behaviour. There is in kingdom living such a thing as a healthy, saving fear, a fear that preserves, a godly fear that should control us. What Dale Ralph Davis means is that whilst the ideal is to be motivated by love and to do what's right, sometimes our baser instincts take over. And what can protect us in those moments is a fear of offending God, of bringing on ourselves God's own judgment. That fear may well have been something that safeguarded David. David certainly spoke of it in those terms when he had the opportunity to harm Paul. So Dale Ralph Davis says, the Amalekite had assumed that no scruples would stop David from seizing the kingship. David assumed that one fear should have stopped the Amalekite from destroying God's king. Fear can be something that saves us. In fact, yesterday in the lectionary readings, in the New Testament lectionary reading, the story was of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. This terrible story of two people who lied to the apostles and who lied to God for the sake of money. And both of them were struck down dead. And at the end of that story, Luke writes, great fear gripped the entire church and everyone else who heard what had happened. And it's not because fear is somehow supposed to replace love as our motivator, but fear can safeguard us from judgment when we risk doing something that's wrong. Really, it's when temptation overtakes us and it seems like it would just be better to do the wrong thing. A right fear of incurring judgment can be a safeguard for us. And so I want you to hold on to that thought. But alongside that, the place of fear that comes through in the first half of this chapter, the place of grief in a godly person's life is really the hallmark of the second part of the chapter, where David writes this song and actually sends it out to the whole of Israel. We're told that it's kept in the book of Jasher. We don't have that book anymore, as we don't have some other books mentioned in the Old Testament. What we do have here, though, is the kind of song that turns up in the Psalms a lot, a song of grief. And it's not it's not an emotionless thing at all. It's deeply emotional, but it's also not a rant that is misdirected. It's grief expressed towards God, and the hope in the end that God can do something about it. In fact, what it tells us is that the right person to address our grief to when we suffer is in fact God himself. So I want to encourage you to read this and to think about it, and also to think about some of those striking things that David says within there. One of them I want to comment on in particular, and this is to do with the issue of vocation. I often think that in our modern world we're so often confronted by stories of success and greatness that we can feel crushed and really we can feel second best when we don't match up to those things. Social media has made this immeasurably worse, because you can scroll and scroll and scroll, and all you're confronted with is the images of other people whose lives look better than we think our own lives are. Now, as a pastor, I can tell you for sure that I hear from people beneath the surface, and I know that people's lives are not like that. My life, by the way, if you think my Facebook feed looks awesome, is frequently filled with grief and hardship. It's just that it's not always particularly easy to post on social media about such things, but it's true. And so the place of grief is often hidden in our modern world. We don't really have an idea of how to express in particular the grief of feeling like we haven't achieved the things that are held out to us as being the hallmarks of what we need for success. So I want to encourage you just to think about here the way that David grieves for Jonathan in particular, and what he says about Jonathan in the midst of it. What he talks about here is Jonathan, whose love and affection for David was expressed particularly in his willingness to come second. Jonathan, back in 1 Samuel, tells David, I know that you are going to be king and that this is what God wants. And yet Jonathan still commits himself to serving David. Now think about this. Jonathan is the crown prince. He's the one who probably for most of his life expected to inherit the throne when Saul eventually died. And yet he's willing here to commit himself to a life of being second to someone else. Not only that, but being second to the very role that he had been born for and bred for and brought up for. Think about the grace that's involved there. For Jonathan to say, I choose to accept the vocation God has called me to of being second to the very one who's come in to supplant me. And this is partly why David grieves. He grieves to see the loss of a friend whose love was characterized by fidelity, by faithfulness to the calling that God had given Jonathan. How infrequently we see such a calling undertaken by people, and how infrequently we see it honoured. Our social media world honours those who reach the pinnacle and does very little to honour those who serve quietly in the background. But in God's way of doing things, there's a recognition given to all those who serve second. There's a recognition that finds expression in these words of lament by David, who sees somebody who's willing to do this. David's gratitude, Dale Ralph Davis writes, highlights Jonathan's faithfulness to his calling, even when that calling was unrewarded and, in this world's terms, hopeless. Such a consideration ought to haunt, in a positive way, the hearts of Christ's disciples. That statement, I will be second to you, that Jonathan makes, epitomizes Jonathan's whole approach to life in the kingdom. So as we consider this lament, and perhaps as we grieve, as we're often confronted with the fact that we don't match up to our society, our culture's ideals, I wonder if we can recover here, out of David's gratitude for his friend Jonathan, something of the vocation of being second to somebody else, second to other people, second in serving, to serve behind the scenes. And as we do that, we should find great encouragement from seeing that this is precisely, of course, what Jesus does. That Jesus chooses the vocation of being a servant over the vocation of living as a luxurious king. I also want to encourage you to seek out ways of expressing your grief and lament, which I know is actually very difficult in our modern church life. Last night, the Blessing song was released, and it's a beautiful song, and we're so encouraged by it. But I sometimes feel like a great deal of our worship and our music is oriented towards only acknowledging God's goodness and expressing an ideal of Christian life that makes it seem like everyone should just be happy and having a wonderful time. But a huge proportion of the scriptures are given over to the grief that we experience in this age of the world. And so I want to strongly encourage you to find those psalms, those songs in the scripture, but also those rare modern songs that express lament, so that we have a way of expressing to God how we feel. I want to read some words. I know it's gone for a long time, but I had a lot to say about this passage today. I want to read from a song which has become very dear to me. Christ is mine forevermore. It's by a group called City of Light. Anglicans, by the way, if you're not an Anglican, they're a wonderful group. City of Light, Christ is mine forevermore. And it's got these words in it. Mine are tears in times of sorrow, darkness not yet understood. Through the valley I must travel where I see no earthly good. But mine is peace that flows from heaven and strength in times of need. And listen to these words. I know my pain will not be wasted. Christ completes his work in me. I really love that. I know my pain will not be wasted. I don't really understand often why I suffer. But when I look at Christ, when I look at Jesus, the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and I see what he achieved through his willingness to suffer by coming second to those who ought to have acknowledged him as the great King of all the world. When I see my grief and my suffering in the light of his work, even if I cannot understand it, and even if I can only really just describe it to God, I can't tell God how it all comes together, but I can be confident that because Christ is working through me, through my suffering, he gives meaning to what would otherwise seem utterly meaningless to me. And I can be certain that one day I will know why I held that pain. I'll be able to see one day why God called me into that vocation of suffering. And my hope is that you can find some degree of confidence in the midst of your own grief, in the midst of your own suffering, to know that God too does give meaning to what you're experiencing now. You might not be able to express it in the words that David does, but I hope that in your heart you can find the confidence that it is worth enduring, because not perhaps David, but God himself will one day honour you and express gratitude to you for the way that you have persevered and carried on. And one day we'll be able to see this beautiful picture of how our suffering is brought together with the Lord Jesus to build something that was beyond anything we could have achieved on our own or without that suffering. I runga i te ingo o te matua te tama, me te wairoa tapu. Amen. Well, let's continue in prayer. Ki ingoa tātou. E te atua, ko koe te take o te rangi Māria. E paengi ane koe te āta noho. Mā te mōhio ki a koe ka ora tono ai mātou. He tino mahi rangatira te mahi ki a koe. Tia kina au pononga i ngā wā e whakahikia mai ai mātou i o mātou hoa whawhai. Kia kora ai mātou, te hunga e oki atu nei ki a koe. E wehi ki te kaha o mātou hoariri. I'm afraid that e kā ana hoki tō mātou ara ki a iu karaiti. Amen. And we say together the grace. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ato whai o tō tātou ara ki o iu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngā tahitanga ki tu wairua tapu, ake. Amen.